the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the
Hello, YouTube. So for starters, I'm going to talk about what is actually written in the book of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 8. After that, I'll discuss when I think the pre-source, which includes the book of Leviticus, was most likely written, and why I believe that to be the most likely time frame. So first, chapters 1 and 2 of Leviticus gets right into graphic details about preparing different types of burnt offerings from the herds and flocks for sacrifice, including having the intestines and shanks washed with water if the offering is a bull, ram, or goat. Other possible offerings include turtle doves or pigeons, as well as offerings of flour with frankincense and other types of grain offerings. Afterward, the text gives more instructions for what not to present as a burnt offering, such as leavened bread or honey. Then the writer of the text mentions the grain offering of the first ripe fruits, which according to this text should include frankincense. Then chapter 3 discusses communion sacrifices from the herd or flock, while chapter 4 discusses accidental sin offerings for the priests, the congregation, and for a chieftain. Offerings for a priest involves presenting a bull before the altar and sprinkling its blood 7 times before Yahweh, and sprinkling some blood on the altar of incense, and pouring the rest out next to the altar of burnt offering. The fat of the offering must be presented, while the skin, intestines, and other refuse must be disposed of outside the camp. A chieftain could offer a goat for a sin offering instead of a bull, and the priest must wipe some of the blood on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour the rest of the blood at the base of the same altar. Any person of the land who sins unintentionally may bring a female kid of the goats for the slaughter. In chapter 5, a soul who hears public cursing and does not report it must answer for his error, and if a soul touches a dead animal or the uncleanliness of a man, then the person is deemed guilty. If a soul swears thoughtlessly, they are guilty and must bring a female lamb or kid of the goats to be sacrificed. If this person cannot afford either one, then 2 turtle doves or pigeons, or a tenth of an ephah, I think that's how you pronounce it, of fine flour is to be offered. If a soul sins by mistake against the holy things of Yahweh, then the person must bring a sound ram for a guilt offering. If the soul sins by deception or fraud, he must return the item he stole or got by way of fraud, and he must make compensation for it by bringing a ram for a guilt offering. Next, the writer gives the law of the burnt offering, stating that it should be on the hearth until the next morning. Afterward, the ashes should be removed. Next, the writer goes into detail about proper grain offerings. Then the writer goes into more detail about offerings to be made when a new priest is to be anointed. Then the writer gives the law of sin offering and of the guilt offering, which the priest is supposed to use to make atonement for anyone who sins. Next, the writer gives the law of the communion sacrifice for Thanksgiving, then rules for vow offerings. Then, the writer instructs people to not eat anything already dead, or to eat any blood. Anyone who does either of these things must be cut off from his or her people. After that, the writer discusses the sacred portion of sacrifices given to priests that should come out of communion sacrifices, namely the breast and the right leg. In chapter 8, the writer discusses the installation of Aaron and his sons as priests, including ritual preparation, the offerings to be given, and the garments they are to wear, which sounds pretty similar to the latter chapters of Exodus that were also written by the priestly source. Moses proceeds to make offerings and to anoint Aaron and his sons, and orders them to stay in the tent of meeting for 7 days. While these descriptions are quite graphic and bloody, animal sacrifice was nothing new in the Levant or ancient Mesopotamia, but the reasons and procedures varied from one culture to another. In the flood portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh, from the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the gods starve after going for a period of time without humans making sacrifices to them. The gods of ancient Egypt took on a more cosmic presence, and rituals were performed to defend against disorder and to keep their world in a state of balance. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, priests usually installed images of various gods and subsequently offered sacrifices to these images before they ate some of their sacrifices. Burning portions of sacrifices on altars to feed the gods directly became a more commonplace practice in Semitic kingdoms, including Judah and Israel. This is the first method of sacrifice to appear in the Elohist source. The more elaborate temple structures, purification rituals, and sacrificial procedures that appeared in the priestly source were clearly added at a later time than the scant instructions provided by the J&E sources. I've seen conflicting arguments from the proponents of Wellhausen's theories and later scholars who have offered differing views on when certain parts of the Torah were written. Wellhausen originally theorized that the priestly source was written during the Babylonian exile period. Richard Friedman, the author of Who Wrote the Bible, made some interesting arguments for the existence of priestly source material prior to the Babylonian exile. One of the main parts of his argument was that the prophet Jeremiah or his scribe mentions, quote, the lying pen of scribes, which would not fit with either the J or E source texts, which were widely known and accepted by Jeremiah's time, or the book of Deuteronomy, which Jeremiah or his scribes' writings reference in a positive light numerous times. The only other alternative, according to Friedman, is that at least some priestly source material was being composed by Jeremiah's time, at least by Jeremiah's time. Friedman took things one step further and claimed the priestly source was written before the book of Deuteronomy, during the time of King Hezekiah, and that priestly source writings inspired King Hezekiah to shut down the high places, destroy the copper serpent idol, and order his people to worship Yahweh at the Jerusalem temple only. If this were true, the writing of the priestly source text would fall between 722 and 701 BC. While 21 years is enough time for a group of priests to make additions to the existing J&E source materials and write their own books, and I can't completely eliminate that as a possibility, I don't think the priestly source was written that early. During the reigns of both King Hezekiah and his father Ahaz, Judah was facing threats first from its sister and rival kingdom of Israel, as well as from Damascus, and then later on from the Assyrian Empire. These threats did not go away until Hezekiah paid tribute to the king of Assyria after the siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. The only pieces of archaeological evidence to support the writing of the priestly source during the time of Hezekiah's reign are various bullae that show an increase in centralization and urbanization in Judahite government, as well as various other artifacts that show more of an emphasis on weights and measures. Assyrian annals recorded the taking of tribute from Hezekiah after the siege of Jerusalem that included some expensive things: ivory pieces of furniture, elephant hides, gold, silver, boxwood, dyed wool, camels, asses, horses, cattle, and sheep. Shortly after the siege, King Hezekiah established a co-regency with his son Manasseh. Under Manasseh's reign, Judah started to grow prosperous again, and this renewed prosperity would have permitted for the creation of a specialized law code for priests. King Manasseh is listed among the kings of the coast, giving tribute to King Esarhaddon for the building of a new palace in Nineveh. I'll post a link to the Assyrian text where I found that below. Conditions under Josiah and the later kings of Judah would have been even better still for a specialized law code to develop, as Assyria would have exerted less control over the kingdom of Judah and less control over what they wrote and spoke as well. Also, in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet or his scribe mentioned sacrifices being made with frankincense, which was included with certain sacrificial offerings throughout the priestly code portion of Levitcus. Frankincense was also mentioned in Isaiah chapter 60, which is considered by modern scholars to be a part of Trito-Isaiah, which was written after the Babylonian exile. Jeremiah or his scribe also mentions in chapter 10 Quote, "Silver beaten into plates is what is being brought even from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz, the workmanship of a craftsman and of the hands of a metalworker. Their clothing is blue thread and wool dyed reddish purple," which all sounds like something written in the latter chapters of Exodus. Isaiah and other earlier prophets don't have descriptions like this in their books. Also, there is a prohibition specifically against the worship of Moloch in the Holiness Code portion of Leviticus. There's no such prohibition in Deuteronomy, not specifically against Moloch anyway. I think Deuteronomy does mention something about kings passing their children through the fire, but they don't specifically mention the name Moloch. But of course, there's neither the mention of the name Moloch or the mention of people passing their children through fire in the JRE source text either. Sacrifices to Moloch, according to the Deuteronomistic history, appear pretty late in monarchic times. I realize that 1 Kings discusses King Solomon starting to make sacrifices to Moloch in his old age, but the descriptions of Solomon's reign were written much later in monarchic times than the 9th or 10th centuries BC. Even if there was a King Solomon who started making sacrifices to other gods like Chemosh and Moloch, wouldn't Isaiah and the minor prophets of the 8th century BC have mentioned those gods specifically? I think they would have, especially Isaiah. According to my own study and various searches I've done, the only mentions of the name Moloch come from the Holiness Code of Leviticus, the end of Solomon's reign in 1 Kings, Josiah's reign in 2 Kings, and the book of Jeremiah, which could have all, I believe, have been written around the same time period. In 1979, 2 silver scrolls were found in Old Jerusalem near St. Andrew's Church. They contain the famous priestly blessing found in Numbers, and were initially estimated to have been created around 650 BC, well into King Manasseh's reign in Judah. The tomb that contained these scrolls was estimated to have been used for several generations, starting around 650 BC. A later re-examination of the scrolls showed them to have been dated to a time before the major Babylonian deportation of Judahites in 587 BC. In Assyrian texts, certain words commonly used in priestly source texts such as Homer, cubit, and other words appear just before and are used more extensively after King Sennacherib sacks Jerusalem and forces King Hezekiah to submit and pay tribute. During Tiglath-Pileser III's reign, the word cubit was starting to be used, but not as extensively as later. During Sargon II's reign from 722 to 705 BC, the words Homer and shekel are first used in Assyrian texts. During Esarhaddon's reign, which was from 680 to 669 BC, the words soothsayer and abomination are first used. While word usage in Assyrian annals may not accurately reflect word usage in the Levant region, I believe it's still important because the Levant region was largely controlled by Assyria during these periods of time. I think a large part of the reason why the word sin is used as much in the priestly source text is because the writers picked up on that word from Assyrians, basically. While Friedman believed that the only influence for centralization for King Hezekiah could have come from the priestly source in their writings, I believe that there's another possible influence. In the first part of the book of Isaiah, which is felt by many scholars to be as close to the words of the actual prophet Isaiah as we can get, the prophet calls for people to worship Yahweh at a single place in Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah has been shown in 2 Kings to have influenced King Hezekiah's decisions, so I think it was entirely possible for Isaiah to have influenced King Hezekiah to create centralized worship in Jerusalem before the priestly writers actually started to write. Even other minor prophets from that period of time and prior mention or hint at Jerusalem being the preferred place for Yahweh to cause his name to dwell. For instance, the prophet Amos states, quote, "Yahweh out of Zion he will roar, out of Jerusalem he will give forth his voice," and then proceeds to denounce other places that are well known to have been other places of worship in either Judah or Israel, like Gilgal, and Bethel. The prophet Micah states in chapter 4, verse 1, quote, "And it must occur in the final part of the days, the mountain of the house of Yahweh will become firmly established above the top of the mountains, and it will certainly be lifted above the hills, and to it the people must stream," end quote. Which is almost exactly the same as the words from Isaiah chapter 2. So the priestly source writers might not necessarily have been the primary influence over King Hezekiah, encouraging him to centralize worship at one place. To summarize, I think the most likely period of writing for at least a good portion of the priestly source, including the priestly code in Leviticus, the priestly source portion of Genesis and Exodus, and the priestly source portion of the book of Numbers, was during the last couple of decades before the end of the kingdom of Judah and the early years of the Babylonian exile period. I think the Holiness Code could have been written anywhere from a few years to a few decades even earlier than that. Most likely, I think, around the time the book of Deuteronomy was written, since the language between the two is remarkably similar in a number of ways. The writers in both these texts discuss much of the same things, although each text does touch on things that the other text does not mention. But I'll be getting into all that more at a later time. But anyway, for now, peace and blessings, and enjoy.